September 2nd, 1945. Tokyo Bay. The morning sun breaks through dissipating clouds, casting long shadows across the deck of the USS Missouri. History holds its breath. General Douglas MacArthur stands before microphones, his voice steady as he declares the war's end. Behind him, flags snap in the Pacific wind. Before him, Japanese officials in formal mourning coats bow deeply, their movements measured, their faces masks of dignity concealing unfathomable defeat. The ink dries on surrender documents. An empire that once stretched across half of Asia now lies broken, its cities smoldering ruins, its people starving, its divine mythology shattered against the steel reality of American industrial might. But this is not a story about that moment. This is a story about what came after, the quiet revolution that unfolded not in conference rooms or on battlefields, but in the narrow streets of devastated Japanese cities, in the burned-out ruins of what were once neighborhoods, in the eyes of children who had been taught that Americans were demons with horns and tails, monsters who would eat Japanese babies and desecrate sacred ground. This is the story of an unexpected gesture, repeated thousands of times across occupied Japan, that would crack open the foundation of everything an entire generation had been taught to believe. This is the story of American soldiers bowing to Japanese elders. To understand the profound shock of this gesture, one must first understand the Japan that existed in those final months of 1945 and the early days of occupation. For 15 years, since the Manchurian invasion of 1931, Japanese civilians had been fed a steady diet of propaganda portraying Americans as barbaric devils, *oni* in traditional folklore terms. School children practiced with bamboo spears, preparing to fight the invading hordes. Women were instructed on how to commit suicide rather than face capture. The imperial government distributed pamphlets warning that American soldiers would rape every woman, torture every man, and burn every shrine and temple to the ground. The Battle of Okinawa, ending just months before surrender, seemed to confirm these fears. Nearly one-third of Okinawa's civilian population died, some in crossfire, many by their own hands, choosing suicide over capture. Mothers threw their children from cliffs before jumping themselves. Entire families detonated grenades in caves rather than emerge to face the American invaders. Japanese propaganda films showed these deaths as noble sacrifices, proof of the righteous spirit of Yamato Damashii, the soul of Japan itself. When Emperor Hirohito's voice crackled over radios on August 15, 1945, the first time most Japanese had ever heard their living God speak, announcing surrender in archaic court language that many could barely comprehend, the psychological impact was seismic. If the emperor himself, descendant of the sun goddess Amaterasu, could be forced to surrender, then perhaps the propaganda had been correct. Perhaps the American devils truly were unstoppable forces of destruction. Perhaps the worst was yet to come. In cities across Japan, families buried their valuables, hid their daughters in attics and basements, and waited in terror for the occupation to begin. Tokyo was a wasteland. American firebombing had killed over 100,000 people in a single night in March 1945. Hiroshima and Nagasaki had simply ceased to exist as functioning cities, their populations reduced to shadows burned into concrete and the walking wounded whose skin hung from their bodies like melted wax. Food was scarce. Infrastructure had collapsed. Orphans wandered the streets. Black markets thrived while people sold family heirlooms for handfuls of rice. Into this landscape of trauma, starvation, and terror, American occupation forces began to arrive in late August and early September 1945. The Japanese people braced for horror. What the Japanese expected was systematic revenge. They expected mass executions, widespread rape, the destruction of the imperial palace, the public humiliation of the emperor, the forced conversion to Christianity, the eradication of Japanese culture. These were not unreasonable fears. They were projections based on how Japanese forces had behaved in occupied territories across Asia, the Rape of Nanking, the Burma Death Railway, the Bataan Death March, the Comfort Women System, the medical experiments of Unit 731. The Japanese military had shown its occupied populations no mercy, and Japanese civilians assumed they would now taste the same bitter medicine. The Imperial Japanese Army had operated on a code that viewed surrender as the ultimate dishonor, worse than death. POWs in Japanese camps faced starvation, torture, slave labor, and arbitrary execution. Japanese propaganda had convinced the population that Americans operated under the same brutal logic, only more so, because Americans were not merely enemies but racial inferiors driven by animal instincts. When American troops began moving through Japanese cities in the fall of 1945, something impossible happened. They did not rampage. They did not pillage. They did not exact revenge. Instead, they began distributing food to starving children. They set up medical stations to treat civilians. They helped clear rubble. And most incomprehensibly to Japanese observers, they showed respect. The first reports were dismissed as aberrations or tricks, some elaborate American psychological warfare designed to lower defenses before the real atrocities began. But the reports kept coming, from Tokyo, from Yokohama, from Osaka, from hundreds of small towns and villages now under occupation authority. American soldiers were bowing to Japanese elders. The gesture was simple. An American serviceman, perhaps a young private from Iowa, a corporal from Brooklyn, a sergeant from rural Georgia, would encounter an elderly Japanese person on the street. The old man or woman would shrink back in fear, eyes downcast, body tensed for violence. And the American would stop, remove his cap, and bow. Not a casual nod, but a proper bow, the kind that acknowledged hierarchy and age and human dignity. The kind of bow that, in Japanese culture, carried profound meaning. For Japanese witnesses, particularly younger civilians who had been raised on propaganda, this gesture was incomprehensible. It violated everything they had been taught about American barbarism. It contradicted years of indoctrination. It was, in a very real sense, the first crack in an ideological wall that had been constructed with tremendous care over more than a decade. The phenomenon was documented extensively, though the full impact would not be understood for years. Private First Class Donald Ritchie, who would later become one of the West's foremost scholars of Japanese culture, wrote in his diary in October 1945, "We were told the Japanese would hate us, fear us, possibly try to kill us. Instead, they treat us with a strange mixture of terror and confusion. Today I saw a sergeant from Indiana bow to an old woman outside a destroyed shop. She burst into tears. Later, another soldier told me this happened to him as well. The old man he'd bowed to actually touched his face, as if checking whether he was real." General Douglas MacArthur, appointed Supreme Commander for the Allied Powers, had issued specific directives regarding behavior toward Japanese civilians. His instructions were clear. Occupation forces were to be firm but fair, to avoid fraternization but to treat the Japanese with dignity. This was not merely humanitarian concern. MacArthur understood that the occupation's success depended on winning Japanese cooperation. Brutal occupation would breed resistance. Respectful occupation might breed transformation. But the bowing gesture was not ordered from above. It emerged organically, from individual soldiers who possessed either innate empathy or enough cultural curiosity to recognize that in Japan, respect was communicated through specific physical gestures. Many American servicemen had been given pamphlets about Japanese customs during the journey across the Pacific. These pocket guides explained the importance of bowing, the meaning of removing shoes, the significance of certain rituals. Some soldiers read these guides carefully. Others absorbed the information through observation, watching how Japanese people interacted with each other. Sergeant Frank Gibney, who served in occupied Japan and later became a journalist and Japan scholar, recalled in his memoir, "I bowed to an old man on a street in Yokohama, just trying to be polite. He stopped dead, stared at me, and then bowed back so deeply I thought he might topple over. A woman nearby, his daughter perhaps, started crying. I didn't understand then. I thought I'd done something wrong. It was only later that I realized they expected monsters, and we were trying to be human beings. The Japanese press, initially tightly controlled by occupation authorities, began tentatively reporting on American behavior. The newspaper Asahi Shimbun ran a story in November 1945 describing American soldiers giving chocolate to children and helping elderly Japanese carry heavy loads. The article's tone was one of genuine bewilderment. One Japanese housewife was quoted, "I hid my daughter when they came. I thought she would be raped." Instead, a soldier saw her doll on the floor and picked it up, cleaned it, and returned it to her. Then he bowed to me. I could not understand. Are these truly our enemies? The symbolism of the bow cannot be overstated in Japanese cultural context. In a hierarchical society where every gesture carried meaning, where social order was maintained through ritual acknowledgement of status and age, the bow was the fundamental unit of social interaction. To bow to an elder was to acknowledge their life experience, their position in the social order, their inherent worth as human beings. For a conquering soldier, a member of the victorious military force that had burned Japanese cities to ash, to bow to a defeated enemy civilian was an act that transcended military occupation and touched something deeper, a recognition of shared humanity. Japanese sociologist Tadashi Fukutake, studying post-war social changes, documented interviews with Japanese civilians about their first encounters with American troops. An elderly man from Kobe stated, "I was taught my entire life that Westerners did not understand respect, that they were like children in adult bodies, that they valued only strength and money. When the American soldier bowed to me, my world turned upside down. If they could show respect, then what else had we been told that was untrue?" The ideological transformation this triggered was profound and multifaceted. For 70 million Japanese people emerging from total war, every assumption about the world had to be re-examined. The emperor was not divine. He had admitted as much in the New Year's rescript of 1946, renouncing his godhood. Japan was not invincible. The burned cities testified to that. The military leaders who had promised victory had delivered only catastrophe. And now, the American demons were bowing to grandmothers on street corners. Children were particularly affected. A generation of Japanese youth had been raised in schools where military training replaced academics, where teachers told them that dying for the emperor was life's highest honor, where American devils appeared in textbooks as literally inhuman creatures. These children had watched their cities burn. They had lost fathers, brothers, uncles to a war they were told was righteous and necessary. They had been prepared to die fighting bamboo spear in hand. And then American soldiers gave them chocolate bars and chewing gum, played baseball with them in cleared lots, taught them English phrases, showed them photographs of their own families back in America, pictures of smiling wives and grinning children and houses with white picket fences, and bowed to their grandparents. The cognitive dissonance was immense. Japanese teacher Michiko Tanaka, who was 16 in 1945, wrote in her memoirs decades later, "When the American soldier bowed to my grandmother, she cried for an hour. She kept saying, 'They are not demons. They are not demons.' It was as if she was trying to convince herself of something impossible. We had been so certain of their evil. If they were not evil, then what had the war been for? Why had my father died at Saipan? Why had my city been burned?" These questions had no good answers, so we simply watched the Americans and tried to understand. The Japanese concept of cow, roughly translated as face or social standing, played a crucial role in this transformation. By bowing, Americans were granting cow to people who had been utterly defeated, whose nation lay in ruins, whose emperor had surrendered unconditionally. In Japanese social logic, the defeated should grovel before the victorious. Instead, The victorious were showing respect to the defeated. This inversion of expected behavior created psychological space for a new relationship to emerge. Documents from the occupation period reveal that many Japanese civilians initially interpreted American kindness as weakness. Japanese militarists had preached that Americans were soft, too comfortable, lacking in spiritual strength. Perhaps the bowing and the chocolate were proof of this weakness. Perhaps Americans could be manipulated. But as weeks turned to months, and American behavior remained consistent, firm on policy matters, respectful in personal interactions, this interpretation could not be sustained. The Americans were not weak. They had, after all, won the war completely. They possessed atomic weapons. They commanded overwhelming military force. They chose to use that power with restraint. This choice was revolutionary. A Japanese policeman in Nagoya, interviewed in 1946, said, "We expected the Americans to behave as we had behaved in China. We expected cruelty because we had been cruel. When they showed mercy instead, it was more powerful than any weapon. It made us question not just the war, but ourselves." Throughout occupied Japan, the bow became a symbol of unexpected connection, a gesture repeated thousands of times daily that served as a tiny bridge between victor and vanquished, between East and West, between propaganda and reality. Each bow was a small act of translation, communicating in Japanese cultural language that Americans understood respect, understood hierarchy, understood that dignity could survive defeat. In the Shinjuku district of Tokyo, now a bustling commercial center but then a landscape of rubble and makeshift shelters, American soldiers would patrol the black markets where desperate Japanese traded anything valuable for food. Military police were tasked with maintaining order and preventing violence. A common scene, an elderly merchant, selling a family kimono for rice, would see the American MPs approaching and freeze in fear. The MPs would stop, survey the situation, and if no actual crime was being committed, they would bow slightly and move on. That bow communicated, "I see you, I acknowledge your desperation, I will not add to your suffering unnecessarily." In smaller towns and rural areas, where American presence was less concentrated but perhaps more noticed, a single soldier's behavior could shape an entire community's perception. In the town of Iwakuni, home to a Marine air base, a Marine corporal named James Rodriguez made a habit of bowing deeply to elderly Japanese he encountered. Word spread through the town. The foreigner who showed proper respect. Children began greeting him on the street. Old women would smile when they saw him. When he was rotated back to the United States in 1946, the town's elder council presented him with a handmade gift, a small wooden carving of a crane, symbol of long life and good fortune. The presentation itself involved elaborate bows on both sides. A photographer captured the moment. The photo appeared in the Marine Corps publication Leatherneck with the caption, "East meets West." The symbolism extended beyond the physical gesture. The bow represented a larger reality about American occupation. It was not primarily about punishment but about reconstruction. The United States, unique among victorious powers in history, chose to rebuild rather than simply extract reparations. The Marshall Plan in Europe and analogous policies in Japan represented a revolutionary approach to post-war settlement. Instead of crushing the defeated enemy and leaving them in permanent penury, the approach taken after World War I, which had helped generate the resentments that fueled World War II, America chose to help former enemies become prosperous democracies. This policy had strategic motivations. A rebuilt Japan could serve as a bulwark against Soviet expansion in Asia. A democratic Japan would not threaten American interests. But the implementation of these policies required individual Americans, soldiers, administrators, teachers, engineers, to interact with Japanese civilians on a daily basis. And many of those Americans chose to show respect, embodied in something as simple as a bow. The psychological impact of these daily interactions accumulated over time. Social psychologists studying post-war Japan have identified the occupation period as crucial in reshaping Japanese attitudes toward democracy, individualism, and the West more broadly. While American policies, instituting land reform, breaking up the zaibatsu conglomerates, writing a new constitution, expanding voting rights to women, provided the structural framework for change, it was the daily human interactions that gave these policies legitimacy in Japanese eyes. A Japanese schoolteacher named Kazuko Watanabe, interviewed by occupation authorities in 1947, explained, "The American soldier who bows to my mother teaches my students more about democracy than any textbook. Democracy, we are told, means that all people have equal dignity. When a conquering soldier shows respect to a conquered old woman, he demonstrates this principle. My students see this and begin to understand." The contrast with Japanese military behavior in occupied territories could not be more stark, and Japanese civilians increasingly recognize this. As information about Japanese war crimes in China, Korea, the Philippines, and elsewhere began to circulate, information that had been suppressed by the wartime government, many Japanese experienced profound shame. They began to understand why other Asian peoples hated Japan, why the Chinese and Koreans and Filipinos had celebrated Japanese defeat. Japanese soldiers had raped, tortured, enslaved, and murdered millions. American soldiers bowed to old ladies. This recognition was painful. It required Japanese civilians to confront uncomfortable truths about the society they had supported, actively or passively. The historian John Dower, in his Pulitzer Prize-winning book Embracing Defeat, documents this psychological journey extensively. He quotes a Japanese intellectual who wrote in 1946, "We told ourselves we were liberating Asia from Western imperialism. But we treated other Asians worse than the Western powers ever did. We were hypocrites." The Americans, whom we called barbarians, showed more civilization than we did. This truth is bitter medicine. Not every American soldier behaved admirably. There were incidents of rape, theft, and violence by occupation personnel. The Japanese government, at American urging, even established a system of sanctioned brothels, the Recreation and Amusement Association, to try to protect respectable Japanese women by providing prostitutes for American troops. This system was deeply problematic and was shut down by American authorities within months, but its very existence revealed uncomfortable truths about occupation dynamics. Yet the overall record of the American occupation remains remarkable. Compared to Soviet occupation of Eastern Europe, or indeed to Japanese occupation of Asia, the American presence in Japan was extraordinarily restrained. Rape rates were far lower than in European theaters. Mass violence was absent. And perhaps most importantly, the occupation had a defined end goal, to make itself unnecessary by establishing a stable, democratic Japan that could govern itself. The bow symbolized this larger restraint. It was a gesture that said, "I have power over you, but I will not abuse it. I could humiliate you, but I choose to respect you. I am here temporarily, as a corrective force, not as a permanent master." Personal accounts from both American servicemen and Japanese civilians illuminate the emotional texture of these encounters. Corporal Raymond Bradbury, no relation to the famous author, wrote home to his mother in Ohio in December 1945, "Mom, you wouldn't believe it. These people were terrified of us. They'd been told we were monsters. I saw a little kid run away screaming when he saw me. It broke my heart. So I started trying to be extra friendly. I learned a few Japanese words. I bowed like I saw them doing. Yesterday, an old man actually smiled at me. I felt like I'd won something more important than any medal." From the Japanese side, there are thousands of recorded testimonies. Yoshiko Takahashi, who was 22 in 1945, recalled, "I was working in a makeshift market. selling vegetables we grew in a tiny garden. An American soldier came up. I was so frightened I couldn't speak. He pointed to some daikon radishes. I nodded. He paid, actually paid, not just took them, and then he bowed. Properly. Not a joke bow, a real bow. I started crying. He looked confused. He probably thought he'd offended me. But I was crying because I realized everything we'd been told was a lie. If they had lied about Americans being monsters, what else had they lied about? Everything, it turned out. Everything. The children of occupation provide particularly poignant testimony. They were young enough to adapt quickly, old enough to remember the transition. Haruki Murakami, who would become one of Japan's most famous novelists, was born in 1949, just after the occupation period, but he interviewed many who lived through it. He wrote, "The image of the American soldier, tall, friendly, with chocolate and chewing gum, became burned into the Japanese post-war consciousness. These men represented America. And America represented a different way of being in the world. More casual. More egalitarian. Less bound by rigid hierarchy." The bow, performed by an American, was revolutionary because it showed that Americans could understand and respect Japanese ways while still being American. You didn't have to choose. You could be respectful and free. The bow was one small part of a larger transformation that would reshape Japan entirely. Within a decade of defeat, Japan was experiencing an economic miracle, rebuilding its cities, establishing itself as an industrial powerhouse. Within 2 decades, Japan was a close American ally, host to major U.S. military bases, integrated into the Western economic and security architecture. Within 3 decades, Japanese electronics and automobiles were conquering global markets. Japan had gone from destroyed enemy to indispensable partner. This transformation had many causes: American aid, wise economic policies, Japanese social cohesion, Cold War dynamics. But underlying all of it was a shift in Japanese consciousness about their place in the world and about the possibilities of democracy. That shift began in small moments in the fall of 1945, when victorious soldiers showed respect to defeated civilians. The American model proved attractive because it combined strength with generosity. Americans had the power to destroy, but they chose to build. They had the power to humiliate, but they chose to respect. This combination was unprecedented in Japanese experience. The samurai code valued strength and honor, but it did not value mercy to enemies. The militarists who had led Japan to war had preached strength through domination. Americans demonstrated strength through restraint. This lesson was not lost on Japanese leaders who would guide Reconstruction. Shigeru Yoshida, who served as prime minister for much of the occupation period and early independence, understood that Japan's future lay in partnership with the United States. He coined the term Yoshida Doctrine, the idea that Japan should focus on economic development while relying on the United States for military security. This doctrine shaped Japanese policy for decades. It was premised on trust that Americans would actually protect Japan, trust that Americans would not abuse their dominant position, trust that had been built bow by bow, gesture by gesture, in the ruins of 1945. The occupation also began a process of cultural exchange that would deepen over decades. Japanese fascination with American culture exploded. Jazz music, Hollywood films, baseball, blue jeans, all became enormously popular. This was not simply shallow consumerism. It represented a hunger for new models of how to live, how to be, how to structure a society. The old models had led to catastrophe. Perhaps American models offered something better. American soldiers contributed to this exchange, often unconsciously. They introduced Japanese people to informality, to the idea that you could joke with superiors, that social interaction didn't always require elaborate ritual. This was revolutionary in a society built on strict hierarchy. Young Japanese, particularly, embraced this new possibility. The rigid formality of pre-war Japanese society began to soften, at least at the margins. At the same time, many Americans stationed in Japan developed deep appreciation for Japanese culture. They studied the tea ceremony, tried to learn the language, visited temples and shrines, collected woodblock prints. This was not the brutal occupation of a despised enemy but something more complex, a cultural encounter between two societies that had nearly destroyed each other and were now, haltingly, trying to understand each other. The bow became a symbol of this mutual effort. When an American soldier bowed to a Japanese elder, he was attempting, however imperfectly, to communicate in Japanese cultural language. When a Japanese civilian taught an American soldier the proper way to bow, she was attempting, however tentatively, to welcome the stranger. These small acts of translation and bridge-building accumulated into a relationship that, while never simple or without tension, became one of the most important bilateral partnerships in the post-war world. 75 years after American soldiers first bowed to Japanese elders in the ruins of defeated cities, the gesture retains its power as a symbol. It represents a road not taken, the road of vengeance and humiliation, and a road chosen instead, the road of respect and reconstruction. It represents the possibility that enemies can become partners, that cultural differences can be bridges rather than walls, that strength can be expressed through restraint rather than domination. The Japanese civilians who cried upon seeing American soldiers bow were not crying from relief alone, though relief was certainly part of it. They were crying from the vertigo of having their entire worldview shattered in an instant. They had been told that these men were monsters, incapable of human feeling or civilized behavior. The bow proved otherwise. And if that was false, then everything else might be false too. The war might not have been righteous. The leaders might not have been wise. The sacrifices might not have been necessary. Everything had to be rethought. This is perhaps the deepest truth about democracy and freedom that the American occupation demonstrated, that these concepts are embodied not primarily in constitutions or elections, though those matter, but in daily acts of respect between human beings. Democracy is not just a system of government. It is a disposition toward other people, a recognition that they possess inherent dignity regardless of their power or status. Freedom is not just absence of tyranny. It is the positive ability to shape one's own life while respecting others' equal ability to do the same. When American soldiers bowed to Japanese elders, they were communicating these truths without words. They were saying, "You are defeated, but you are not worthless. Your nation made terrible mistakes, but you as individuals retain your humanity. I have power over you, but I will not use it to diminish you. We can interact as human beings, not just as conqueror and conquered." In the vast literature on the American occupation of Japan, the bow rarely receives extensive analysis. Historians focus on constitutional reforms, land redistribution, educational changes, economic policies. These are indeed the mechanisms through which Japan was transformed. But mechanisms alone do not explain why a proud nation accepted direction from foreign occupiers with relatively little resistance. The answer lies partly in exhaustion and devastation, partly in skillful American policy, but also partly in those countless small gestures that communicated respect. An elderly Japanese woman interviewed in the 1980s, reflecting on her experiences in 1945, said, "The American soldier who bowed to me that day probably doesn't remember it. It was nothing to him, just trying to be polite. But I have never forgotten. It was the moment I understood that the world was larger than I had been told, that people were more complex than propaganda suggested, that enemies could become friends. That single gesture taught me more about democracy than any lecture could have. Democracy means you bow to old ladies even when you don't have to, even when you have won the war, even when you have all the power. You bow because it is right. This is the truth about freedom and human dignity that emerged from the ruins of Tokyo and Hiroshima and Nagasaki in that strange autumn of 1945. Power without respect breeds resentment and future conflict. Strength combined with humility builds partnerships that can last generations. The American soldiers who bowed to Japanese elders were not performing calculated propaganda. Most were simply trying to be decent human beings in an awkward situation. But their decency had strategic implications. It helped transform an enemy into an ally, a relationship of domination into a relationship of cooperation. Today, Japan and the United States remain close partners, despite occasional tensions. Japanese democracy, born from defeat and occupation, has proven robust and enduring. The fierce militarism that drove Japan to war has been replaced by a pacifist constitution and a prosperous, peaceful society. This transformation was not inevitable. It required wise policies, economic aid, international cooperation, and Japanese determination to learn from catastrophe. But it also required something simpler and more human, the willingness of victors to show respect to the vanquished. The bow became a symbol of that willingness. It represents the best possibility of what strength can mean, not the power to destroy, but the power to build, not the ability to humiliate, but the choice to honor, not the triumph of one people over another, but the recognition of our shared humanity even across the deepest divisions of war and ideology. In the end, the Japanese civilians who cried upon seeing American soldiers bow were crying because they glimpsed a truth that propaganda had hidden from them. That kindness is not weakness, that respect costs nothing but gives everything, and that the most powerful force in human affairs is not violence but decency, not conquest but compassion, not empire but equality. These are the truths that democracy rests upon. And these are the truths that a simple bow, repeated thousands of times by young American soldiers in the ruins of defeated Japan, helped to communicate when words alone could never suffice. The bow endures as a reminder that we are all, in the end, simply human beings trying to find our way in a difficult world, that the gestures we choose to make toward each other matter more than we know, and that respect, once given freely even to enemies, can transform the world in ways that weapons never can. This is what those Japanese civilians understood, standing in the rubble of their shattered cities, watching American soldiers bow to their elders. This is what made them cry. Not just relief, not just surprise, but recognition. Recognition that the future might hold more hope than the past, that humanity might triumph over hatred, that out of the ashes of the most destructive war in history, something better might yet emerge. And it did.